Hello and welcome back to another Raw Sport Weekly, another F1 special. We've been doing quite a few of these because there's a lot to talk about. So thank you so much for watching. If you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening to the podcast, thank you very much. And thank you for making the last F1 focused podcast the second most listened one that we've put out. So thank you so much for making that happen. And hopefully you'll enjoy this one as well. So if you don't know who I am Josh Sim. I am the head of sport at Raw 1251 AM, the University of Warwick student radio station. Thank you so much for joining us. If you go through the shows we do football, we do Formula One, we've done American football, we do a variety of shows covering different sports. And yeah, for those who are listening who are back at uni, welcome back to term 3. Hopefully everything's not too stressful at the moment, fingers crossed. And yeah, plenty of F1 and stuff to talk about. So in a minute, I'll run through what we're talking about in the show. Of course, if you like the podcast episode, subscribe to the podcast for future episodes. If you like the video, you can like it, subscribe to the channel, and follow us on our various social media channels, both of which will be in the links to the podcast description and the video description. And yeah, and in a minute, I'll put up the social medias of our panelists as well, so you can follow them individually as well. So yeah, a few things to plug on my end. Recently, for those who are American football fans, we put out last week a draft, 2021 draft / free agency sort of special. The draft obviously coming up. We're recording this on Wednesday. The NFL draft kicks off on Friday. So if you want a bit of a primer, if you want to kind of get up to speed with what to look forward to, what to expect, you can go watch or listen to the podcast. Both are out. It was myself, Curtis Lung, and Riddick Carrier. So some really good discussion there about, like, for example, what the 49ers are going to do with that third pick. Sam Darnold at the Panthers, what kind of fit is he going to be there, etc., etc. So some good stuff to watch or listen to if you're new to American football, or if you are a bit out of the loop and want a bit of a quick refresher. Also, we, and when I say we, I mean Raw 1251 AM, is looking for a new head of sport. So if you are interested in the role, feel free to send me a message. In fact, I'll put my Twitter account there. Feel free to drop me a message if you have any questions about it. But yeah, you get to, if you are watching and you're interested, you get to sit in the host chair. You get to lead our coverage of the Olympics, Tokyo, which at the moment is still going on. Please don't take that as a guarantee, but fingers crossed it's still going on. And the Euros, which looks more likely to go on, to be honest, as well as all the sort of major sporting events from pretty much June to, March 2022. So a lot of good stuff there. So the by-election is coming up soon for that role. So if you are interested, have a bit of a think about it, and hopefully you run, because it's a great role. I've enjoyed it, and yeah, looking forward to see who comes next. But anyway, that's enough. That's all the stuff we have to plug. That's enough for myself. Coming up on this F1 show with my two panelists who I'll bring up, we're going to recap Imola. It's been a week, 10 days or so. A lot of things have happened. We're going to try and recap some of the biggest moments of it, and some of the drivers who shone or didn't shine there. We're going to talk about Miami 2022, the news that's being added to the F1 calendar. What do we think of it? Impressions of the track, etc. We're going to talk about sprint qualifying, which was just announced in time for this podcast. Do we like it? Do we hate it? What do we think is going to be the major effect of it from happening? A bit about Formula E on the weekend. We're starting to cover a little bit of other motorsport, and Formula E provided a lot of entertainment. So we'll have some analysis of that, and then finally Portimao, we will preview this weekend's Grand Prix. So with that in mind, I can't do that all by myself. I'm gonna need some people to help me out. So as usual, first up, a regular on Raw Sport shows, stalwart, someone who, I'll ask both panelists to give me a rating out of 10 for Imola, as to, what did they, in terms of watchability out of 10, what would they give it? It's subjective. It's up to them, really. So let's bring on our regular Joe Spagnoli. Joe, how are you? And rating of Imola out of 10 in terms of watchability.
I'm very happy that I can focus on motorsport rather than football, which for me has been a massive dumpster fire for the last few weeks. Watchability, I'd say Imola was about a 9. However, just to start the flagellation from minute number 1, this is the guy who predicted a Mercedes 1-2 this weekend. So my predictions, as per usual, are 2 out of 10, but the race itself was fantastic. Whoever would have known the rain that we so often crave in Formula 1 would make an interesting race?
Yeah, that is very true. 2 things to add there. First of all, you have noticed the professional bookshelf is gone. That looks gone from my side. I'm back in the student house, so expect wardrobe, bed, hopefully made bed, that look as well. Secondly, you talk about football. On this coming Saturday, we will be, I don't know if we're recording or it will be a live stream. I've yet to decide that, but we will be covering the European Super League predominantly because it feels weird to talk about anything else. We know we've left it sort of late with the coverage, but it's been good to sort of get all the fallout and all the information before diving into it. So you have that to look forward to, or not if you're exhausted about listening to European Super League stuff. But let's bring on our other panelist. First time on a Formula One show. He's been on a football show, but first time on a Formula One show. And I know he's very active in terms of the Formula One fandom at Warwick, Sunday at Formula One Society. Will Kingswood's with us. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. What's your rating for Imola out of 1 out of 10 for watchability?
I'm gonna be. I don't think it was as good as it originally looked about 10 minutes before the race. I will still give it like a 7 out of 10. It was definitely a good race, but I do think that Bahrain was a bit better, and I think the rain, even though it looked promising, did make the race a bit predictable in terms of tyre strategies and things like that.
Yeah, of course. I suppose the one thing we all were looking forward to was a race again, because it's been 3 weeks between Bahrain and Imola, as we sort of acknowledged in the last show. We got the sequel. I'd like to say that sequel delivered, unlike a lot of other movie sequels. I'm not going to name them. So let's dive in, I guess, and hear the race results of the top 10. Quick one for the podcast listeners. I'll quickly read it out because you obviously you don't get to see this on camera. So Max Verstappen won the Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton came second for the Mercedes. Lando Norris picked up third in a very impressive podium, as we'll dive into. Charles Leclerc finished fourth. His teammate Carlos Sainz came fifth. Daniel Ricciardo and the other McLaren came sixth. Pierre Gasly back in the points after Bahrain's disappointment. He came seventh in the AlphaTauri. Lance Stroll came eighth in the Aston Martin. And then ninth and 10th, you had the 2 Alpine cars, Ocon in ninth, Alonso in 10th. You may have thought Kimi Raikkonen finished in the top 10, but he picked up a time penalty that ultimately pushed him down the order, and that's why Alonso got promoted into the top 10. So that's the top 10 for you. There were obviously other incidents involving other drivers outside the top 10 that we will certainly get into. But as we sort of like to do, we like to start at the top and just make our way down to the bottom. So with that said, Max Verstappen, he wins in Imola. I think a lot of us predicted that in the previous show, so maybe not a huge surprise. But Will, given that he didn't finish the last Imola Grand Prix, he retired last year. His track record in Italy is quite spotty, and it was obviously very changing. The conditions kept changing seemingly by the hour. It was quite an impressive drive from Max Verstappen.
No, definitely it was. I think he drove almost the perfect race. Obviously, after qualifying, he'd only qualified in third and probably thought that he would have quite a few issues maybe getting towards the front, especially considering his rival Hamilton was on pole. But getting that start straight off the line, straight into first place, and just managed the race from there, and basically had a cakewalk to the finish once Hamilton had made his mistake.
Yeah, and Joe, I think he did have one wobble. I do remember he had one sort of wobble in the wet, but ultimately, this was it felt like a very mature drive from him. Like, aside from that one wobble, there weren't that many mistakes, and he had to deal with, obviously, a red flag, a race stopping and restarting, and he just pulled it off. It was just a really confident drive from him.
He had one wobble out of Rivazza Uno, but it was under safety car conditions, and he collected it within about a second, so it was absolutely fine. Part of the reason why I thought Hamilton would win this race over Verstappen originally was because of experience in the wet, maturity. I wasn't even thinking about Verstappen's spotty record on the peninsula. But in this race, Verstappen gave a very Hamilton-like performance where behind him, Hamilton was actually the one making mistakes, which we'll definitely get onto soon. Right from the off, he looked completely on it, but also completely in control. I thought there was a chance after the red flag restart that we'd get Lando Norris maybe leaping into the lead on those soft tyres. But again, on that first lap, Verstappen just positioned his car perfectly and then just eked out an advantage with the natural power and handling advantage that the Red Bull has. An absolutely stunning performance, one of his best victories in Formula One. And also overtake of the race, which happened at the very first corner. Starting in second gear in those conditions was a genius move.
Yeah, it's. I mean, so much happened in that race. You sort of forget that first lap where it was such a daring sort of lunge into that chicane, and he obviously managed to pull it off. Yeah, I don't think there's much more to add on him, so we can move on to Lewis Hamilton, as you said. It was, I guess, his race was a really interesting one, Will, and then there was that moment, obviously, where he rarely makes mistakes, so that was a huge surprise. And you see him go wide into the gravel, and sort of the nose of his car sort of neared the wall, and you wondered if it was all over. And obviously, there was sort of a big delay. And did you think that it was over for Lewis Hamilton, that race, the race when he was in the gravel, or were you confident that he would be able to sort of get himself back on the track and sort of then amazingly climb his way back into a podium spot?
I mean, I think that most people probably thought that the race was over as soon as he slid into the gravel trap, especially it was almost like a Vettel 2017 scenario, but he managed to get out of the gravel trap. And then he was really lucky with the red flag, considering it allowed him to get back onto the lead lap. But I think that race sort of showed the best parts of Hamilton combined with the mistake, because as soon as he got back behind some of the lead cars like the Ferraris and the McLarens, you always felt that he was going to get back up to second place, probably because of the dominance of the Mercedes and the Red Bull over the midfield at the moment. But it was a good performance to recover from the mistake he made.
Yeah, it was. I haven't watched the new Mortal Kombat movie, but it did feel like a fatality when he ended up in the gravel trap. But Joe, I mean, I know we glossed over Verstappen a bit, but this race, when the season comes to its closing stages, when you look back at it, it does feel like this was an important one championship-wise, because Verstappen couldn't lose this race. Like, if he did, then he would be in trouble, because obviously everything seemed to go to his plan. Lewis obviously making that mistake. If Verstappen had lost it, obviously it'd have been a major miss for him. But the fact that Lewis recovered from that mistake and managed to recover second place means he still leads the championship by a single point. In hindsight, this could be a big race for. I mean, both drivers essentially took it like they will see it as they did everything they could in this race. So it's not like an opportunity missed, but it will feel sort of significant given the fine margins that we're already seeing between the two drivers after two races.
The irony was, after the pit stop debacle and Hamilton had another slow pit stop, which put him out behind Verstappen, they also overcut in the changeable conditions, which didn't help. There's an argument to say that even if Hamilton hadn't made that mistake, which for him was fairly unusual in those changeable conditions, running onto a wet part of the track on slick tyres, just lacking patience getting past some of the back markers, it felt, it was a very uncharacteristic error from Hamilton. But the most ironic thing of all is that with the power advantage that the Red Bull seemed to have, especially in the braking zones, there's an argument to say that this race wouldn't have ended any differently if he hadn't made that mistake, because Verstappen, as he proved against Norris after the restart, was just so good at holding position. So yeah, I mean, it does feel very Abu Dhabi 2012, which was when Vettel came through the field somehow on a track where it's impossible to overtake. And as a result, Fernando Alonso barely claimed any points over him in the championship battle. This kind of had that attitude, that kind of feeling. Although this is round 2 of the season, this is already one hell of an exciting championship battle. And, as you say, there's 1 point in it. If Hamilton hadn't got that fastest lap, this would be the first time in, I can't even think how many years since Hamilton last didn't lead a championship. That's how far ago it was. Fantastic.
Yeah, and it was, again, I said Verstappen's drive was very mature. This one obviously was also very mature. It was very experienced as well, because he sort of waited until he was within reach of Lando Norris and made that move stick. It wasn't someone who was aggressively pushing the tires, at least to me it felt like. And so that was I don't know, it was very patient, and it was just very much someone who knew what they were doing. Obviously didn't let that mistake rattle him, which is a testament to his mental fortitude as well. But yeah, it was a great race. And I mean, Will, did this race, I know we'll move on from the top 2 after this, but did this race, did you learn anything new about Verstappen or Hamilton as a whole, or did it sort of just fortify what you already knew about these two, that it's going to be a big battle throughout this year?
No, I think it did just fortify what we already knew. I think we've seen that Verstappen has really developed in the last few years away from the sort of quite haphazard driver he was, especially in the first half of 2018. And we obviously know Hamilton is one of the greatest that in almost everything he does on the racetrack. So I think this has shown, these first 2 races especially, that this may be one of the closest championships for the last 10, even last 15 years.
Yeah, it does. And it certainly, it was a worthy sequel to Bahrain, and hopefully, going forward, these 2 drivers will be challenging at the front. Let's move on to the guy who came in 3rd place, who I don't think it was a name any of us threw out in the preview show a few days before Imola. Lando Norris in the McLaren, who has been nothing short of impressive throughout these first 2 races. I mean, Joe, this is someone who obviously has had a lot of experience in McLaren, obviously very accustomed to getting the best out of the car, and showed it once again. Even you can factor in his qualifying performance, which obviously his lap was deleted to track limits, but throughout the weekend he was just someone on the top of their game.
You're right, Josh. All the way through the weekend, that car had podium potential written all over it. And granted, he wasn't the only one who had a lap time deleted because of going over the white lines at Piratella, but the underlining point is, yes, the lap should have been deleted, but the finer point to realise from that is that, yes, this guy does actually have the pace to get onto the front row, because, of course, both Red Bulls kind of disappointed in qualifying, it must be said. Aside from a poor-ish start to the race, Norris did not put a foot wrong. I would argue this is by far his best Grand Prix weekend to date. Those 2 rounds in Austria last year, personally, the first one didn't impress me anywhere near as much as the second, the Styrian Grand Prix, but this is on a whole other level of that. The consistency in changeable conditions. Was there anyone else who made fewer mistakes than him during the race? Even Leclerc and Sainz especially were making errors behind him, going off track. I can't remember Norris ever getting anything wrong. And again, that strategy to go onto soft tyres for the restart over the mediums, yes, I know that means that you have to save by the end, and that was one of the reasons why he had to let Hamilton through. But I think Hamilton would have gotten through anyway, and without that tyre advantage, there's a good chance he wouldn't have been able to rocket past Charles Leclerc. A hugely deserved podium. I even said to you just before the restart that Norris could actually win that race. I really did believe it, just on account of how well he managed the tyres and how bloody quick he was in those really tricky conditions, because that's not the easiest car on the grid to drive.
No, it's not. And we can factor in, we can add a Daniel Ricciardo discussion to this as well, who came in 6th place. But Will, to me, there's a clear difference in each driver's level of trust in the car. Obviously, Ricciardo's new. Obviously, testing only took place in Bahrain. There was only 1 testing period anyway, so he wouldn't have had that much time in the car. There's sort of there's a big gap between, Lando's sort of comfort with the McLaren car and Ricciardo's comfort with the McLaren car. And even Ricciardo admitted it post-race, but you can tell, can't they, the way that Lando he knows aggressively how to get the best out of the car, and Ricciardo is still working it out. I don't know how many people would have sort of foresaw that Lando was going to have such an impressive start in this McLaren, but it's quite amazing to see at the moment.
No, I would agree with Joe. I do think that was his best ever race so far in F1. I do think that what we're seeing is Lando has really become a team leader in McLaren over the last few years. And that although Ricciardo, obviously, he's new to the team, and I think that is why he's a bit slower than he probably should be. I think he's got a real fight on his hands to bring it up to the speed of Lando. And I think just Lando Norris, he almost put it on the front row. He almost got in between the Mercedes and the Red Bulls on qualifying pace. Obviously, race pace might be another matter, but if he can consistently do that and perhaps even get a second, a third somewhere, he'll cause issues for Red Bull and Mercedes, because they're going to have to take him in mind when getting past him over the first few laps, rather than just leaving them in the dust and just dominating the race as they would normally do.
Yeah, and Joe, I mean, just a question about, obviously, McLaren made the decision very early on. Ricciardo was in front of Lando track position-wise, and they asked him to let Lando through. And obviously, it would have been interesting to see if, per se, the move didn't work out. Would they swap them back or not? We won't know. We won't know until the next time they get into that position. But what did you make of the implementation of team orders there? And do you think it will have any effects going forward? What was your sort of reaction to the decision made by those at McLaren?
I mean, my reaction to it, honestly, is how little of a reaction there was from everyone involved. Ricciardo, after the race, was jovial about it, as you would imagine. He didn't honestly seem too bothered. He understood that Lando was the faster car. He'd had the better early mid phase of the race. And, you're speculating as to what would have happened. I'm absolutely certain that if Lando hadn't pulled ahead, they would have swapped those cars back around. Maybe Lando would have been allowed to go through later on pure pace, but again, we're in the land of conjecture. I believe that the dynamics of that McLaren team, unlike, Red Bull back in the Vettel and Webber days, unlike Ferrari, Fernando is faster than you. This didn't feel like that, despite the fact that in terms of the phrasing of it, it was the most blatant example of team orders of the three. I think Norris understands that Ricciardo is going to take a while to get used to this car. And to be fair to Daniel, it's not like he's been given an easy start. Bahrain is not a good track to have your first race at a car when it relies so much on braking performance, which Daniel's always struggled with when it comes to getting into new cars. And then Imola, which is a rare track in Formula One anyway, in really tricky, greasy, changeable conditions. Ricciardo's being outperformed, sure, but it's not like he's being absolutely blasted. And regulations, track limits aside, Ricciardo has also outqualified Norris at both rounds. So my prediction that he'll outqualify Norris 2-1 this year is still good.
That's all we care about, your predictions staying on track. But you raise a good point that Ricciardo has been a slow starter, especially when he's switched teams around. If you look back at his history at Renault and even maybe...
Not so much Red Bull, to be fair.
Yeah, that's true. We're curious to know what your thoughts were on McLaren making that sort of early decision, and if you think it will have any effect going forward, just any general reaction.
No, I just think it showed real maturity from everyone involved, and I do think that if there was another situation where Ricciardo was faster, I think that Lando Norris would let him pass without any issues. I do think that team dynamic at the moment seems to be most healthy on the grid, and that if this continues in the future, they could genuinely be a real challenger in the latter half of this season and potentially into 2022.
Yeah, so it looks very good for McLaren in terms of the fight for being the best of the rest, per se, if you give the top two a tier of their own. But let's talk about the other team that's sort of challenging them for that sort of position, Ferrari, and we'll group Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz together, 4th and 5th. again, very, very solid performances. Sainz, for me in particular, given that he's swapped teams, he seems to have, really adapted to that Ferrari car quite quickly. Joe, just general thoughts, because again, a very solid race from them. And, we know how excited the Tifosi can be when a Ferrari, has a strong start, but signs are looking good for them. Pun not intended.
I mean, after last year, it doesn't really say much, to be honest, Josh. You can only go up from what the hell happened in 2020. But honestly, Sainz's performance this weekend I wasn't overly impressed by it. I said in Bahrain that what I was expecting and what ended up happening was a very conservative approach. You don't want to make mistakes in your first races for Scuderia. The amount of times where Sainz went off track, there was another instance where the favourite corner of drivers to go off this weekend, Rivazza coming out of there, going straight into the gravel trap. I feel like Sainz went off there multiple times, and yet he ended up just behind Leclerc on the running order, who had... Charles Leclerc is just unbelievable. He was my driver of the season last year. So far this year, he's put into absolutely blinding race weekends. I said, maybe controversially in light of the dynamics at McLaren, I said that Ferrari were my team of the weekend, just like they were in Bahrain. As you say, signs are looking positive. But yeah, I think Sainz forgot that the Tifosi weren't actually in the stands. He was really pushing this weekend, a lot more than you'd expect. But it didn't really work out for him in the teammate battle during the race, and especially not during qualifying. If that hadn't been such a race of attrition with the cars ahead, I suspect that Sainz may not have been as close to Leclerc based on qualifying position alone.
Yeah, and Will, we haven't talked to you on an F1 show, so I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on Ferrari's start to the season, and, does that raise your expectations for them going forward, or was this sort of in line with what you thought how they would do coming into the season?
I mean, yeah, like Joe said, there was not really any way they could go from last season other than up. I think Ferrari are very similar to McLaren at the moment in that they've got their younger driver seems to be the team leader because they've been at the team for the last few years, and then you've got a more experienced driver coming in to still getting used to the car. And I do think that Sainz and Ricciardo are on very similar trajectories at the moment, in that they'll take a few races to get used to the car, but as soon as they do get used to it, then they'll start challenging. And I think that you're going to see McLaren and Ferrari be having very similar results throughout the season, like almost akin to how Mercedes and Red Bull seem to be in a fight for the Constructors title at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully that sort of battle keeps going. It's great to have sort of a very competitive nature, certainly between those four teams. And certainly some of the teams that we're going to move on to as well, who I think just for strategy wise, and in the case of AlphaTauri, strategy may have let them down a bit. We're talking about Pierre Gasly, who came 7th, who might have come higher, let's be honest, if he didn't start the race in the wets. So there was a bit of a strategy misfire on that end. We'll talk about him first. We'll get into Yuki Tsunoda in a sec. But Joe, I saw your reaction there. Were you frustrated to see that AlphaTauri had started Gasly on the wets, but also sort of impressed that he managed to somehow pull back a top 7 finish as well?
If I was with my lot in Italy, I would have driven down to the racetrack halfway through and beaten up every single person on the AlphaTauri pit wall for what they did. The funny thing is, after the race, Pierre was even saying it, they wanted to change to intermediates. They could tell that there wasn't enough rain to justify the blue-walled full wet tyre. But then when they had a perfect opportunity, an early safety car, to come in and change it, they didn't take it. They kept him on that ridiculous choice of tyre, even when Esteban Ocon, way back through the field, had realised his mistake and changed it as AlphaTauri did. When he began losing time hand over fist, they kept him out because they thought they could, negate the damage. He was losing in real terms about 6 or 7 seconds a lap. It only takes 20 seconds or so to 25 seconds or so to get a pit stop done. By the end, they kept him out for about 10 laps. Then they reneged on that decision, bring him in for Inters, where he's in absolutely nowhere. I said, Carlos Sainz finished 5th partly because it was a race of attrition. I'm looking at Pierre Gasly and AlphaTauri. If they'd started on those intermediate tyres, I guarantee you he would have been in 5th place. Let's not forget, on the road he was 8th as well. It took a post-race penalty for Lance Stroll, a deserved one, to put Gasly up to 7th. But really, I put Gasly in my top 5 for the weekend, partly because he's my favourite driver, but also because he did demonstrate an awful lot of maturity coming through the field with basically no mistakes, especially by comparison to Tsunoda. But in truth, again, part of the reason he got through the field was because it was such a race of attrition. Horrible strategy from AlphaTauri, and that's 2 races in a row where both drivers have seriously, they've been either screwed out of points or they've bottled out of points. AlphaTauri should have at least 3 times the points they do right now.
Glad you got that off your chest there. But in all seriousness, I think a lot of us, if I remember correctly, it's a prediction show, which you can obviously find the podcast episode and the YouTube show on, I don't know, the list of shows we've done. I think a fair few of us had Gasly as a sort of possible podium pick. So I understand the frustration that it didn't work out for him. Will, I just want to get your thoughts on what happened to Gasly. And I don't know if you want to quickly comment on Tsunoda as well, who obviously was, unfortunately started quite far back the grid. So it was going to be a bit of a struggle for him. And then sort of after the restart, I think it just looked like he just got very aggressive on the tires and spun out. And that pretty much made his race a non-event after that. So just curious to know how you thought AlphaTauri did this weekend.
No, I think AlphaTauri have really underperformed so far at the start of this season, because they should have. Gasly obviously got quite unlucky with losing his front wing in Bahrain, and then definitely got really unlucky with the strategy, and I'm actually really impressed he managed to get back to 7th, considering the amount of time he was losing on those wet tyres. As Tsunoda, obviously he had his crash in qualifying, so to come back from 20th, and I think he was up in 8th at one point until his spin, was actually quite impressive. But obviously, again, he's new, he's still quite inexperienced, and I think that was just a bit of inexperience showing with his spin just after the safety car restart.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's funny how 3 weeks gives people a chance to really hype up Tsunoda, and I don't say that as a negative. He obviously had a very impressive showing in Bahrain, but somewhat impressive, Joe. For your first race, it's points finish isn't too bad. I know you want to weigh in, and I'm teeing you up, but obviously came down a bit to earth in Imola, and obviously now at Portimao sort of leveled out now. Now we're just sort of in the middle ground with him. But I know you want to weigh in on Tsunoda as well, so go for it. What do you want to say about it?
Yeah, it's another botched prediction of mine going into this weekend. I said that I knew it would be at the expense of one of the Ferraris, but I was saying that Yuki Tsunoda would make Q3. As it turns out, the only thing he made in qualifying was the wall on the exit of the Variante Alta. It's a really poor accident for a start, an accident that doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. As Martin Brundle said on the commentary, he should have gotten out of that a lot sooner. He shouldn't have tried to collect it. It's gone at that point, but keep it out of the wall. It's not an area of the track where you would expect an accident like that, especially in dry conditions. Then there was, he got, as I've already said 1,000 times, such a race of attrition. Not much of his progress through the field was quote unquote legitimate because it was difficult to overtake in those conditions. But he gets a perfect opportunity to score points, and then he bottles it at literally the first corner off of a restart. I'm not without sympathy for him. He's a new driver in Formula One. But if we're gonna lambast Mazepin and Schumacher for what they did this weekend and last weekend, we also need to extend that lens to Yuki Tsunoda in a car that is, let's be honest, so much more drivable than the mess that Haas Ferrari is at the moment. He had a really, really bad weekend overall, constantly outpaced by Gasly in practice. I know Gasly's amazing around Imola. He proved that much last year, but he shouldn't have been getting outpaced to that extent. Qualifying was a disaster, and the race, again, just throwing away so many good points. You say he had a great showing in Bahrain, Josh, but again, the reason he was able to overtake so many people was because he disappointed so much in qualifying. I'm not anti-Tsunoda, but this hype train has built up far too quickly. His showings so far have been nowhere near as impressive as so many people seem to think. I'm sorry.
I think I'm just quite forgiving, to be honest, and just maybe.
True.
I mean, so maybe that's why. But I'm excited. I'm excited to see. he's the only, I'm very excited to see how he does. So, I not invested, but excited. So, but I understand. I think it did. I think the 3 weeks gave people a lot to talk about. And when people ran out of topics, Tsunoda's sort of really, solid start was something that provided good conversation fodder. So I feel like that's maybe what happened.
The irony is that people have been comparing him to Max Verstappen as a young Red Bull Academy prodigy, and also his, shall we say, expletive radio communications, which I do love, by the way. I really love the banter in FP3. But in this race, he looked a lot more like Alex Albon. It was a very similar accident, actually, to what Albon managed after the restart at Imola last year. He just needs to calm down a little bit. Like, there's no rush. There's like 22, 23 races this year. And just calm down, Yuki. You're a talented driver. I've never, as a driver, risen through that many ranks of a junior formula that quickly. He's got time. Calm down.
Oh, boy.
Chill.
I would love to set up a swear jar and I would make so much money from him if I set up a swear jar in the AlphaTauri garage. But anyway, I don't think there's a whole much more to add. AlphaTauri, we'll show the constructor standings in a bit. Their mistakes have unfortunately left them quite a distance away from Ferrari, who I think is the next team up in the standings. So we'll see what happens at Portimao, which we'll get onto. 8th place in the classification was Lance Stroll and the Aston Martin. And again, another team similar to AlphaTauri. One driver had Sebastian Vettel, we talked about the last time. He struggled again. It's fair to say this weekend. Lance Stroll did well to come 8th. Obviously, the wet conditions suit him a fair bit, so that obviously played to his advantage. But Will, what do you make of? Aston Martin this weekend? Again, it felt like it was just a tale of two different stories for two different drivers this weekend.
It does seem that the low rake setup is affecting them, and obviously I think Stroll was quite fortunate to come 8th. I think he's always been good in changeable conditions. That's probably why we obviously saw his pole position in Turkey last year, and we've even seen it when he was driving for Williams in 2017. He put that car on the front row. Obviously, the Red Bulls had penalties, but still qualifying at 4th in 2017 was quite an impressive achievement. And it does appear that Vettel will go on to Vettel, who's near Aston Martin, who does appear to be struggling still. And I think Stroll is really showing that he's not the daddy's cash driver that a lot of people are originally giving him the title of.
Yeah. Joe, I know you want to weigh in on. I can't tell if you want to weigh in on Lance Stroll, Sebastian Vettel, or just weigh in on Aston Martin's performance this weekend. There you go.
No, I was doing a little dance on screen because it reminded me of the Sim Dane Daddy's Cash song, which is low-key a banger, especially the Gangster Gunter Steiner feature towards the end. The funny thing is, I barely noticed Lance Stroll this weekend. That Aston Martin is like 6th or 7th fastest car on the grid, even on a good weekend. It's some distance behind the AlphaTauri and the Ferrari from what we can tell. So for Stroll to have had a pretty damn impressive performance throughout the weekend and still only finish 7th on the road, 8th in the final classification is an indication, as Will said, of just how much that low rake setup is affecting them. I just think it's so funny that, having been the team demonized from the start of last year for the pink Mercedes debacle, they're now the ones complaining to the FIA and to the Formula One authorities about rule changes. It's quite funny, but there's no question at the moment that Stroll is the de facto team leader, and it continues what I've been saying all along, that there is just something not quite right with Sebastian Vettel at that team. You have to wonder, maybe this was the only seat available for him, but has he made the right decision going to that team?
Oh boy. We are sort of retracing our conversation a few weeks ago, so I don't want to dive in too much again. And obviously we talked about the Nico Hülkenberg signing as well, which, knowing how sort of intensively supportive the F1 fandom is of Nico Hülkenberg, I'm sure his name's going to crop up in the discussion going forward, especially if Vettel's form continues the way it has done. So someone who definitely needs a really strong performing at Portimao, so which we'll get into, as I said. But yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot to add on Aston Martin. And then closing out the top 10, the Alpines of Ocon and Alonso. And the only thing I want to ask Will is, it felt like this was significant for Ocon in terms of his, not that his place has been questioned, but he's sort of been, very under the radar, just solid middle tier performances. But he'll take a lot of confidence out of beating Fernando Alonso in this race, right?
Yeah, I mean, out of all the teams, I would say that Alpine is probably the one without a team leader at the moment. Obviously, you have Alonso, who's won 2 world titles, but he's come back. He hasn't really started to perform. And obviously, you've got Ocon, who's been at the team for a while, but he's always been relatively consistent. And he's been up and around there, especially last year. We saw it at Sakir. Obviously, that was quite fortunate, but he managed to get his podium. And I think that it's hard to say how good Alonso's going to be at the moment, because obviously he's still coming back. He's still got to adjust. But I don't think that Alpine is that good of a car, and I do think it will be between Alpine and Aston Martin for the more middle end of the midfield.
Yeah, it does feel like that, and I don't think there's too much to add on Alpine. I think it was just, again, beneficiaries of some of the accidents, which we'll now talk about. Some of the drivers who finished quite down outside the top 10, and we will start with Sergio Perez, who came at 11th. So we'll start with those at the top of the bottom 10. I mean, the qualifying promised so much. Managed to get himself onto the front row, second place. The discussion on Saturday was he might be someone who might beat out Max Verstappen in terms of the race. Then the race happens, and he finishes 9 places behind his teammate. Joe, do you want to have a go at just talking about Sergio Perez and his topsy-turvy weekend at Imola?
I was so mad at Sergio Perez during that race, partly because Red Bull are my fantasy team in the Raw/Boar/F1 Society Fantasy League, which you should all join immediately. So that cost me an awful lot of points, him bottling a likely podium. But more annoying was the fact that this was the first time Max Verstappen had been out-qualified by a teammate since Daniel Ricciardo was at Red Bull about 3 years ago. So it's a massively significant moment. And I was very quick to send our very own Eleanor Burgess, massive Max Verstappen fan, a screenshot of Perez being ahead of Verstappen in the timing sheets. She didn't respond until after the race. Rarely has a piece of trash talking from me gone wrong so quickly. This was a really error-prone race from Perez. Another one of the drivers who went wide out of Rivazza Uno. Multiple errors of just pushing the car too hard, losing balance, which in this year's Red Bull is a bit harder to do than last year's car, which was a bit of a mess, aerodynamically speaking. After Bahrain and that amazing charge through the field, the question is back again, the same thing that we've been asking ever since Pierre Gasly signed. Is that second Red Bull seat cursed? It's going to take him a while to get integrated into the team, sure, because they're not really used to having a star driver or a pay driver in quotation marks, which is kind of what Perez is. But yeah, it's just a really odd weekend. And after such a good qualifying, it all went downhill very quickly in the race. He fell down the order a lot quicker than making those mistakes.
Yeah, it was just, I don't know. This is a guy who obviously has spent a lot of time in Formula One, so very experienced. Obviously, again, as we're seeing with Ricciardo, to a lesser extent, Sainz, it takes time to adjust to a new team. And also you can extend that to Sebastian Vettel, of course, and Fernando Alonso. But Will, is there something you can pin it down to at the moment? Was it just a bad race on Sunday, or do you think there's something else that is having a part to play in Sergio Perez sort of misfiring in the races for Red Bull?
I mean, what we've always seen is that I think Red Bull have really set the team behind Max Verstappen, and his driving style is really, really specific and really difficult for the second driver to get accustomed to. I do think Perez will do it better than Gasly and Albon, because obviously he's a lot more experienced. He's been in F1 for almost 10 years now. But I do think it's sort of a combination of that and just a bad race in what admittedly were very difficult conditions. And I think that if you give him like 1, 2, 3 races, he will start to apply his race like performances that we've seen in the past alongside the qualifying performances that we saw on Saturday.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard some people say that maybe he's someone who might peak during the back half of the season just because of the him getting used to the car. So maybe that's something that maybe is more in line with what we hoped for, at least with expectations at what we hoped for coming into the season. But yeah, disappointing outing from him. I'm sure he will be keen to bounce back coming up in the next race. So, but not a great outcome after weekend Saturday that promised so much. Not a great outcome on Sunday. Alfa Romeo had just a typical, I don't say typical, and a solid race about them. So I don't know if there's a whole lot to discuss there. Do we want to talk Haas? Do we want to talk about Haas? Joe, do you have any thoughts on Haas? Because we're not expecting a whole lot from them, I guess. So there wasn't too much to talk about on that end, but their drivers did have again some driver errors. Obviously, first timers to Formula One, so sort of to expect. I loved how Mazepin left it into the penultimate lap to spin, I think, of the race. So if you're playing F1 bingo, you could cross that one off at the very end. But any thoughts on? And also Mick Schumacher also had a bit of an incident midway through the race. Is there anything? What do you want to say anything about Haas, or should we just leave that topic alone?
What I loved, it's funny that you mentioned like that penultimate lap spin from Mazepin. My favourite bit of commentary during the entire race was Anthony Davidson seeing that on the screen and going, knew he wouldn't let us down. Because actually I'd been predicting, and if you go back to the last stream, I made predictions that Mazepin would spin coming out of 3 different corners on the track. He actually only managed to spin out of one of them, so relatively speaking, he had a fairly decent weekend by comparison to the absolute bare minimum that I expected of him. Schumacher again I think that accident is more on Schumacher than anyone else. It's a pretty embarrassing one to make. It's very reminiscent actually of George Russell's accident at Imola last year, which owing to his popularity, he was able to get away with criticism for. The same kind of happened to Schumacher again this weekend. We need to call him out for how bad of a mistake that was. But the only thing I have to say about Haas, and it's basically a worse version of what I said about Ferrari last year. It's one thing having a car that's incredibly slow. It's another altogether to have a car which is absolutely awful to drive. Under throttle, out of any slow speed corner, that Haas is a mess. I'm not going to say I feel sorry for Nikita Mazepin, but I feel sorry for any driver that has to drive that. And Gunther Steiner will be pulling what hair is left on his head out throughout the entire of this year. Because if this is the last race where they're bringing upgrades to, this is going to be a very, very long season for them.
Yeah, it does feel like that. Will, we've not had you on an F1 show, and it's very fun to talk about Haas for F1 fans. I feel like that's sort of the mood around the fandom. So do you want to weigh in on Haas, or just go for it if you want to talk about them?
I think by now Haas have been left behind by Williams. I think Williams are up sort of around Alfa Romeo. I think those two teams will be together, but I think just Haas, it's a terrible car, and they've said they're not going to upgrade it. So this season's just going to get more and more painful for them. And obviously that's not good for their drivers, Mick Schumacher, who people like a lot more than Nikita Mazepin for obvious reasons. And just Mazepin, he's just really slow. I think I read somewhere that he was about 2.5 seconds per lap slower than Mick Schumacher at some point. And I think it really just sums it up that they both finished behind Vettel, who retired.
Well, you say that, but they didn't exactly finish last because we had some retirements in this race. Nicholas Latifi in the Williams, who had a very strong qualifying by his standards. Obviously, very early on, ended up crashing the car. Obviously, funny enough, he came together with Mazepin, if I'm correct. But I think this time you could put I don't know. It was a bit more of a racing incident. It wasn't really, you could really put blame on Mazepin for that one. Joe, don't.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I thought you were going to say you couldn't put blame on either driver. No, that was Latifi. 95% of the blame was on Latifi.
I'm in agreement on that one. I know people like to bash Mazepin, but I'm not going to bash him for this one. But I think the one of the big talking points from the Sunday was the other two retirements, namely Valtteri Bottas and George Russell. Now, I know you're both chomping at the bit to weigh in on this one. Obviously, they came together. I think Russell was behind him, wasn't he, initially, track position wise, and then sort of came up alongside him, and then it happened. They took each other out. I think we can all agree it was a racing incident. I don't think there was. I don't think there was 60-40 like blame on one driver than the other. I think they both have some level of, they had both played a part in the incident. But what do we think? Will, I'll kick it off with you. What did you make of the incident? And also sort of the aftermath to the incident, because in a way that was sort of very telling as much as the incident was itself.
No, I think there's sort of two things here. I was quite surprised with how Russell reacted to the incident. We haven't really seen him get that angry before, and I do think it does show that he is still quite inexperienced. He's always been seen as someone who is like one of F1's next big stars, but it shows that he sort of still needs to iron out his like temperament a bit more. But why was Bottas even in that situation in the first place? His teammate was up in second. He was chasing Max Verstappen, and he was languishing down in, I think it was like 9th and 10th were the two positions that they were in. He should have been up there. He should be much closer to at least the McLarens and the Ferraris, rather than racing with a Williams in the lower half of the points.
I dare say that if not, I guess Lewis Hamilton saved Toto Wolff's weekend, because I imagine it would have been very interesting to see what his reaction would have been if Hamilton had been stuck in the gravel trap for the rest of the race, and that Bottas and Russell took each other out. Some good points that you've made there. Joe, I'll kick it to you for the same question. Reaction to the incident and sort of the aftermath as well, because as Will said, you mentioned the popularity of George Russell. I don't think many of his fans were expecting him to kind of, for lack of a better term, lash out in sort of a very soft way, but still sort of express sort of anger towards a fellow driver.
Least of all myself, honestly. I couldn't believe what I was seeing from George Russell, both in the aftermath of the crash and the race itself. It's worth pointing out that he's obviously reneged on those comments. He's apologised to Toto Wolff and Bottas and everyone else involved, but as you say, it was a racing incident. I completely agree with the decision of race control and the FIA not to punish either driver. It's one of those things where I have sympathy for both of them. Obviously, Russell was closing in at about 20, 30 kilometers an hour, so you'd expect to be allowed through. But also, having done a lot of simulator work at Imola, I know that going into the corner, going into Tamburello on that far inside line in those conditions would be very difficult for Bottas. So, to be honest, Russell should have been expecting he'd come over a little bit anyway. It is really a case of 50-50, maybe 60-40 blame on the side of Russell. But again, a really bizarre response to it. And what we need to remember is, and this is what I was going to say last weekend, but we didn't really talk about Williams because, as you said earlier, we've reversed cursed them and then cursed them again. But I've been saying that if there's a sack race in Formula One this year, if there's going to be a mid-season driver transfer, which is a lot more common in Formula One than people think, I've been low-key predicting that Mercedes will swap out Bottas for Russell in the middle part of the season, because especially in qualifying, Bottas was abysmal, and Hamilton's comeback through the field really does indicate, as Will said, that Bottas should not have been in that position in the race at all. But honestly, coming out of this, Russell has actually made it more likely that Bottas holds on to his seat. It's not just the aggression of the accident, it's what happened afterwards. And I actually have a lot of respect for Toto Wolff for coming down on Russell as hard as he did after the accident.
Yeah. Obviously, the move you sort of mooted there, would be a very interesting one. Just because, I mean, when a team, I guess the team obviously put a lot of confidence in Bottas, and to suggest such a move would suggest that they would have lost confidence in him. Will, I know you wanted to weigh in on the transfer. I'm just going to add a second question onto that. What do you think there are any long-term ramifications of what happened in that incident, or do you think things will sort of be smoothed over by this weekend? So, yeah, what do you reckon?
I think it will probably be smoothed over just because Russell doesn't want to upset his potential employers for the next few years, and Bottas doesn't want to get sacked by his employers for the last few years. But I do think that we might see the transfer. I will actually agree with Joe, because before, obviously, the race became a wet one, we saw Hamilton qualifying first, but Perez and Verstappen were second and third, and that was the first time in a long time where it wasn't two Mercedes versus one Red Bull. It was two Red Bulls versus one Mercedes. And if we had seen a dry race, we could have probably seen Perez being put on a different strategy just to compromise Hamilton's strategy. And if that continues for the next few races, then it becomes more and more likely that Mercedes might want another driver to be up there consistently, just so Red Bull can't pincer Mercedes with a 2v1 strategy, and it has to be it, and it makes it a 2v2 fight on level terms.
Well, as it turned out, it was a 1v1 fight because of Sergio Perez's mistakes as well. So it didn't sort of bite them this weekend. But yeah, going forward, if something like that was to repeat, then obviously there'd be larger questions. Joe, final thoughts on this, and this will be our final question on the race, I guess. Do you expect any long-term fallout from the incident, or do you think, like Will said, it might just be smoothed over by the time we get to Portugal?
It suits everyone to smooth it over by the time we go to the Algarve, and to be honest, I suspect it already will have been to some extent. We have to assume, maybe it's expecting a little bit too much of Bottas, that this kind of on-track rivalry between the two isn't likely to repeat itself anytime soon. The final point I will make about this, just again on the transfer, do you know, just as a question to you both, do you know how many F1 seasons have ever passed without a mid-season driver transfer?
No. Well, not off the top of my head, no.
Only one.
Oh, interesting.
2018 is the only F1 season where no drivers have changed halfway through. So this is not a crazy prediction at all. People have this idea that F1 grids are very, very fixed relative to other sports. And it's not just George Russell. You've got to remember that, as we'll talk about in a bit, Formula E, there are two Mercedes signed drivers over there, Stoffel van Dorn and Nick de Vries, one of whom has experience in Formula One, the other of which is a Formula 2 champion, just like George Russell. If Russell, for whatever reason, doesn't impress and Bottas continues to disappoint, Formula E is going to be over by the time the summer break comes around. It's not out of the realms of possibility, crazy though it sounds, that Mercedes could bring one of those guys in if Bottas continues to underperform to this extent. Seriously, he needs to up his game, because as Will said, he should not have been in that position during the race at all. And it is another race, just like Monza last year, where Hamilton is proving that you can overtake in that car, Bottas showing himself up, relatively speaking.
You know why I didn't think of all the transfers? Because I think they've all taken place, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of them are taking place with the Mana, with the HRT car. There were a lot of transfers mid-season.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a team at the front of the grid, I think it's rare, maybe, or uncommon per se compared to the back of the grid. That's probably why I didn't think of it. But it should be. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens going forward. Let's put up the driver standings, sort of wrap up discussion. I'll read them out for the podcast listeners. So Lewis Hamilton is leading the championship on 44 points, 1 point ahead of Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. Lando Norris is third in the championship with 27 points. Charles Leclerc is behind him on 20 points. Then you have Valtteri Bottas fifth with 16 points. Carlos Sainz 2 points behind him in the Ferrari. Who's also Sainz is level on points with Daniel Ricciardo in the McLaren. Then you have Sergio Perez 4 points behind with 10 points in the Red Bull. Pierre Gasly, this weekend's finish probably put him into ninth place with 6 points in the AlphaTauri. And finally, Lance Stroll rounds off the top 10 with 5 points for the Aston Martin. So just briefly, Will, anything stick out to you so far? Obviously, it's just 2 races, so a lot of this is going to be, I'm sure, going to be changing. But does anything stand out to you so far?
I think I'd have to go for the disparity between the Red Bull and Mercedes drivers at the moment. You've got Hamilton, and it's definitely going to be a championship of Hamilton versus Verstappen, and it will be up to the second drivers to help change who is going to win the 2021. Yeah, it's 2021 these days. 2021 World Championship.
Yeah, and actually what I did want to say was this Hamilton-Bottas dynamic at the moment, it sort of reminds me a bit of Hamilton-Heikki Kovalainen in McLaren, obviously a decade ago. And obviously Kovalainen and Bottas are both finished drivers, so it's quite easy to make that comparison. But there's sort of shades of that at the moment in terms of what each driver is getting out of the car, per se, of the top-level car. But that's another discussion for another day. Joe, any remarks to make of what the drivers' top 10 championship standings are at the moment?
Just how amazing Lando Norris has been so far. And, you know, if we're continuing to forecast doom for Bottas in particular, and for whatever reason Perez doesn't acclimatise to that Red Bull, continuing the tradition of that second seat being cursed, I'm sorry, but Lando Norris could stay in 3rd place by the end of the season. He's just been that damn impressive.
So you're saying that might happen, but you're not willing to make that prediction for sure?
No, I'm not going to make it after 2 races, both of which have been kind of anomalous. But no, he's been so impressive. And I emphasise this because I was the one forecasting that Ricciardo would absolutely smash him. Long way to go yet. But yeah, Norris is performing at his best level ever.
Fair enough. Well, I've also put up the constructor standings for those watching the video, and we'll read them out for the podcast listeners again. Mercedes lead the Constructors' Championship on 60 points. They are 7 ahead of Red Bull in 2nd place. 3rd place is McLaren on 41 points. They are 7 points, coincidentally as well, ahead of Ferrari on 34 points. Then some distance away, you have AlphaTauri in 5th on 8 points. Aston Martin are 6th on 5 points, and Alpine, with their 2 drivers finishing the top 10 in Imola, get their first points. They are 7th on 3 points. Williams, Alfa Romeo, and Haas obviously yet to score points. So, I mean, any thoughts on this one, Will? I mean, it does seem like we have 2 close battles between 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th, respectively, and who knows if AlphaTauri can break into it. But promising in terms of competitiveness for sure.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is for 4 pairs. Off the top of my head, you're going to see Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren. You're going to see Aston Martin and Alpine for like the middle bit, because I just think AlphaTauri are too quick for them, but too slow for Ferrari and McLaren. Then you're going to see Alfa Romeo and Williams just fighting out. There'll be like 1 point difference between the 2. And if Haas score this season, I'll be extremely shocked.
Well, Joe, you've made that prediction that Mazepin's going to score points at some point in the race calendar. So you think Haas are going to score points, but
there's a long way to go. Don't laugh at me yet.
Just remind anyone who's watching or listening for the first time, which races you think they might score points in?
Owing to like mad strategies or races where half the field retires, but somehow not Mazepin, because apparently that makes sense, I've predicted that Mazepin will score at least one of Catalunya, Zandvoort, or the Hungaroring. Because if you go forward, if you manage to do some YOLO strategy, starting on hards or something, and get up to 6th or 7th, good luck trying to overtake around there. But again, the Haas is so bad, and Mazepin's so off the pace that I now feel stupid for even thinking of that prediction.
I promise I'm not hanging out to dry. It's just we happen to have first-time panelists every time we've done an F1 show, and so it's made sense to repeat that prediction. So I'm not trying to make you sound like an idiot. Like we just have to enlighten whoever is on the show about your predictions. But on a serious note, is there anything you want to say about the constructor standings at the moment, or just it looks like a promising season so far?
I just want to see how close AlphaTauri get to Ferrari. I mean, there were so many occasions last year where AlphaTauri were more or less the pride of Italy. No occasion more than that than Monza itself. But my worry is that AlphaTauri are going to be very reliant on one driver. I'm just hoping that Tsunoda can rein it in a little bit. Because if he does, there's no reason they can't challenge for fourth.
Yeah, for sure. With that, that's probably the end of our Imola sort of recap. We've gone an hour and 4 minutes, which is decent. We've really dissected that race. So I don't think there's more to add. And we will run around some of the news stories. Now, I'll just read this one really quickly. It broke most recently. I'm going in sort of chronological order when these news/races, in the case of Formula E, sort of happened. But it was confirmed, I think, yesterday that Callum Ilott has been signed on to Alfa Romeo as a reserve driver alongside Robert Kubica. I don't think there's a whole lot to add here. We've obviously talked about him when he was in contention for that Haas seat, which didn't happen, obviously. But just quickly, it's just a good idea to add a young talented driver. I guess the more the like, it just brings you better quality. I guess it's just a good thing.
I mean, yeah, it makes sense. What you're probably going to see is Kimi retire in like 1 or 2 years. Mick will probably be moved up to Alfa Romeo, and then Callum Ilott will get the Haas seat and trounce Nikita Mazepin, which is what we would all like to see.
Yeah. Joe, any thoughts on Ilott joining Alfa Romeo?
I mean, as a reserve driver who may even have contention with Kimi Räikkönen for a reserve, not Kimi Räikkönen, Rob Kubica for a reserve Grand Prix place, there's a good chance that Ilott manages to score more points than Mazepin, who has a full-time drive at Haas this year, which, in light of how things went down in Formula 2 and Formula 3, is quite funny considering the history between those two. It makes perfect sense. It just confirms that Alfa Romeo are going to continue to be Alfa Romeo, supplying the Ferrari Young Driver Academy rather than just Sauber.
There you go. So that was a little bit of news that broke today, but I think the big one in this sort of around the paddock news section was Miami. We've obviously heard like sort of the rumors about it for a while. It was officially confirmed by Formula One. And here is sort of the look at what the track will look like. I think on YouTube, they've released sort of a first look sort of simulation of what it would look like from a driver's perspective. So you can go onto the Formula One YouTube channel and check that out. But Miami, now we'll unpack this. There's two sides, I think there is to it. There's the spectacle side and the actual track racing driving side. So let's break down the track and racing side first. Obviously, we've had a fair number of new street circuits in recent years sort of crop up onto the calendar. What do you make of what the Miami one presents compared to some of the other ones that we've seen?
I think, just looking at it here, I think this is a track with 2022 designed in mind. I think if you raced on it this season, with the amount of fast corners that you see there, the following would be almost impossible. But with the 2022 regulations being designed to make following a lot easier, I think that it could potentially present quite a good race. But obviously, we've got to wait and see for how much effect the 2022 regulations have on the racing.
Yeah, and obviously, by the way, for those who are listening to the podcast, we've got a picture of the circuit up, which you can find by just Googling Miami 2022 Formula One, and you'll quickly find these. But Joe, I mean, same question really. What are your thoughts on the track and sort of what the experience will be for drivers, I guess, at least in terms of on-racing action?
It's better than Jeddah, and it's better than Sochi. Not better than that many more. There's one section of the track. I mean, this will be more for the visual listeners. If you look towards the lower end of the track, you go through that right-left sweeper, and then there's a hard braking zone at the end of a straight. I deliberately didn't look at a map of the track until the simulation lap came out. And as you were going into that hard braking zone left, I was just thinking, please don't go right immediately after. Please don't go right immediately after. And then it did, and I just wanted to punch through the screen because that could just nullify any overtake going into the initial left. It reminds me a lot of Yas Marina, which I know is really unusual because this looks a lot faster. And I hope with next year's cars that there will be more overtaking than that place. But it's a car park, Josh. It reminds me a lot of the old Caesar's Palace track, which was pretty damn atrocious and literally built in the casino car park. I think the appeal here is going to be Miami itself. Also, there's a chicane towards the end of the second sector, which looks like something out of a Formula E circuit. So, chaos galore.
Yes, and that brings me to the second point, the spectacle point. And I think those obviously that links to the business side of it. It makes, to me at least, it makes obviously a lot of sense to add a second race to the US and to the North America. A third race to North America if you count Canada as well. It's obviously a fan base that Formula One's looking to grow. Miami is obviously a very much destination city, just in general. So in terms of that side of things, I guess the off-track sort of perspective, it makes a lot of sense that Formula One's heading to Miami.
Yeah, I think it was always on the table. It's been on the table for years, the Miami Grand Prix. I think there was one design that had it going over a bridge at one point, but residents didn't like it. I do think, obviously, you're looking for the spectacle, you're looking for the glitz and glamour of Miami. I'm not sure how much glitz and glamour you can get out of Miami. But I think it's more for the spectacle, but I do think it has the potential to bring in a good race. I'd just say, going back to the corner that Joe was having a go at, I think, was that the one that sort of looks like turn 4 at Sochi on the right-hand side?
Turn 4 at Sochi is like a 90-degree, isn't it? So it's more of a sweeping corner than that. It's just the whole hard braking zone into a left and then an immediate right, which makes it very difficult to overtake, which has Yas Marina written all over it, to me anyway.
Yeah, okay, mate. I think I might have been looking at the wrong one, but I do think give it a chance and then we'll come to our conclusions as soon as we've had the first race there.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, it'll be interesting to see where they put it on the calendar as well. My suspicion is that it's going to be behind the Montreal Grand Prix, that June sort of time. That makes sense for me. Obviously, it was interesting. I've friends in the US who are Formula One fans, and interestingly, obviously, hurricane season's obviously a thing in Miami as well. So maybe June isn't that right date. I know I've just run a spanner in the works, but like that was one point that was raised. I went, oh, that's quite interesting. But as a whole, I mean, that aside, it did feel like June was the best time because you're capturing that sort of spring break time. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people flocking over to that city anyway. So it makes sense on that front. And obviously, yeah, as we said, the business and tour and attraction side is going to be quite a spectacle.
Can the Hurricane really do that much more damage than Nikita Mazepin? That's all I have to say.
Well, there's a lot of spinning involved. Both involve a lot of spinning, and I would say the safety of people around them are also quite compromised in both scenarios.
Luckily, I mean, the walls are very close to the track, even relative to like the onboard simulated lap that we had at Jeddah. This track is very confined, so I don't think the car's going to go flying anywhere. But yeah, I mean, like you say, as long as they don't put it next to Austin, which seems kind of stupid for the North American market share. I've never liked that 1 week trip over to Canada and then going back to Europe afterwards. It seems pretty wasteful. So I think you're pretty much bang on the money, Josh. Summer months in Miami. But my God, that's going to be a hot race though. Humid as well.
I liked how the news sort of broke on the day of Imola, which obviously was bucketing rain, and obviously everyone loved the rain. It's the rain side of it, and then the news broke that we're going to sunny Miami. So that was an interesting contrast to have in terms of the way the news cycles work. But yeah, it should be fun, and obviously fully expect something similar to Singapore in terms of music, entertainment. If Pitbull isn't headlining, if Will Smith isn't there, I'm going to be disappointed. Personally, I don't know. There's a lot of. I'm sure. I mean, Fast and Furious had a concert in Miami to celebrate the latest movie. So the movie hasn't even come out yet. So I'm sure Formula One will be able to stump up the budget for whoever they want to bring over. But we can dreamcast music entertainment another day. So I think Miami should be fun. Obviously the on track stuff remains we'll wait to see it on that front. But certainly in terms of the spectacle, should be good stuff and should be also great to bring along more fans to the sport as well. So we'll bring it there. The next thing I wanted to bring about was Formula E. And so myself and Joe, we watched it this weekend that took place in Valencia. Let's start with Saturday. I mean, the only place to start is with Saturday, and we'll talk about it briefly. What an ending. What an ending. For those who don't know, and I'll quickly read out the results. Nick de Vries was the classified winner of the race. I say classified winner very specifically. In second place was Nico Müller in the Dragon. And in third place was De Vries' teammate for the Mercedes, Stoffel Van Dorn, who we've alluded to De Vries and Van Dorn just before. So Van Dorn came third. And then 5 other drivers, 6 other drivers classified and scored points. The rest of the field were all disqualified. Now, I read that aloud, and people who don't watch Formula E may be quite confused. So, Joe, I don't know if you want to quickly explain what happened in Valencia on that Saturday, and give some of your thoughts as well.
I'll try to keep it brief because it is a very difficult sport to explain, especially in terms of the chaos that always seems to unfold on race day. So Formula E cars are basically, when the car gets to 0.0% of energy, that's usable energy. There's a little bit left in the tank in quotation marks after that, and the moment you get down to 0.0%, as the French driver Norman Nato seems to be making an unfortunate habit of in the last few weeks, you're disqualified because you've used more than the allotted usable energy for the race. The circuit Ricardo Tormo in Valencia has been often used as a testing location in the past. Wet weather on Saturday. We've never really had a quote-unquote proper track for a E-Prix weekend before, and oh my word, did it deliver some chaos. There were 5 safety car periods during the race, and the comparison you make with Formula One in this instance is a safety car is a really good opportunity to save fuel, harvest energy, and so you've basically got more resources to use towards the back end of the race. Safety car slows it down to begin with, but in theory speeds it up a little bit afterwards once the tyres and the cars have warmed up. In Formula E, for some reason, because they really want to hammer home the energy conservation aspect of the race, they were taking X amount of usable energy off of every car after every safety car period, which for some drivers in the field was absolutely devastating. And what made it worse was the format of Formula E races isn't a set amount of laps. It's not a set distance. It's not even a time limit. You get to 45 minutes and then there's an extra lap on the end of it. So if you finish the current lap on 44 minutes, 57 seconds, you've got to go round again, and then again after that, 45 minutes plus 1 lap. The field got it wrong. Formula E took too much usable energy from each car, and as a result, Antonio Felix da Costa came out of the final corner expecting the checkered flag to be there, and it wasn't, because Techeetah had messed up the timings. Formula E had messed up the energy, which meant that basically no drivers had the usable energy to complete the race. You said it was an amazing spectacle, Josh. As someone who's been a champion of Formula E since the start, I was honestly embarrassed for what happened.
Speaking to people who watch Formula E more regularly than I do, granted it was the first Formula E race I'd watched live in a very long time, they were of a similar perspective to you, to be honest. So I see it, I understand it. It's just for me, I don't watch Formula E that often, it was quite something to watch. So yes, people can, I think YouTube highlights are available for the race, so people can go check it out. It was astonishing. Also, just aside from that, you also had drivers, obviously the usual characteristic mistakes, spinning, contact with each other, gravel traps, all that kind of stuff as well, that caused all the safety cars in the first place. So a lot happened there. I don't think the Sunday race was a lot more straightforward. For those who know, Formula E race on the Saturday and the Sunday at the same track. Jake Dennis of BMW won on Sunday and led from start to finish. A very straightforward, very impressive drive from him. Don't think there's a whole lot more to say on that front. So we can move on to the final sort of news story, and that is, and we'll bring Will back on. It is sprint qualifying, which luckily that news broke before we were recording, so we get to talk about it, which is great. Now I will I will quickly read out sort of the rules, and I'll have them on screen as well, actually. For those who don't know, and for podcast listeners, you can obviously Google F1 sprint qualifying and find the information that I've got. But essentially, it is a race. It will replace the usual qualifying session on the Saturday. It will be run over 100 kilometers, and it will last around 25 minutes to 30 minutes. It will essentially be a bit of it's in the name. It's a sprint, essentially, for these drivers. They will get points. The top three will get points. And it will sort of determine the starting grid for the Sunday race. And I believe it's called sprint qualifying. It's because they don't want to take away from the actual race on Sunday. So that's why they didn't want to call it the sprint race. And therefore, it sounds nitpicky, but that's why they called it sprint qualifying. So that's what the format is in a nutshell. We from what I've read, it's understood that this will be implemented in possibly Britain, possibly Silverstone, if I'm correct. I am just scrolling for those who don't see. I think Monza is the other one that it's been mooted for, and then the third one I saw was Brazil, but obviously with uncertainty around Brazil as a whole, we don't know. But certainly Monza and Silverstone, it could be tested out there now. So that's what it is. Will, what are your thoughts on F1 sort of experimenting with the qualifying format and putting some sprint qualifying sprint qualifying races that aren't called races but are really races into the Grand Prix weekend?
I don't have any problem with them experimenting. Obviously, we always want to find the best format for the best spectacle for the entire weekend. But I just think this is a bit pointless. If they were doing a reverse grid setup, I'd be more inclined to watch it. But what you're just going to see is you're going to see a shorter race. So it loses almost some of the tyre strategy, things like that. And it's going to still be Verstappen and Hamilton out the front. Teams will probably take less risk because if you crash in this, then you're starting at the back for the actual race that actually matters. And I just don't see how this will liven up the spectacle in any way, especially considering how much they want it to liven up the spectacle. I just don't think it will do what they want it to.
Yeah, that's sort of the argument I've sort of seen, isn't it? It's sort of cars already. There's already a bit of a discrepancy between, say, Mercedes and AlphaTauri example. So it would sort of further the advantage that some of those top ranking cars might have. That's sort of the argument I've seen. I personally am on the fence. I sort of want to see it before kind of coming to any conclusions about it. Joe, what are your thoughts of them experimenting with sprint qualifying?
I'm really excited that they're going to give Mercedes and Red Bull more points. Only the top three finishers in sprint qualifying get points. 3, 2, 1 from first to third. I thought they'd do like a Formula 2 style system where not as many drivers score points and there aren't as many available, but like finishing first gets you 10, 15 points like in Formula 2. It just seems, I mean, you guys are thinking of crashes, as you should. Drivers are going to be very conservative. I'm thinking about reliability. These cars are already the most reliable ever, but the restrictions on components are so tight that it's very normal to see, an energy storage unit, a gearbox failure, as Vettel proved on only round 2 of the season at Imola. It's one thing for a driver to bin it during sprint qualifying and end at the back. How gutting would it be to get 20 minutes through that race, make up a couple of positions, and then have to start at the back because your gearbox packs up, something that's got nothing to do with the way you performed? I'm on the fence. If there's any season where you try this thing out, it's this one, which already seems like a bit of a holding pen for 2022 anyway, certainly for the Haas F1 team. But it's just a shame that someone like Leclerc or Gasly, they put the car on row 2 when it really shouldn't be there. Sprint qualifying is just another opportunity for them to fall down the field. So I'm fairly mixed on it.
Yeah, I think. Look, I mean, we're talking about, obviously, in theory, we will see when we come to it. I guess we'll do a bit more of a detailed deep dive, maybe, on what the implications could be. But certainly something interesting. My theory is obviously if you don't know about something until you try it. So I applaud them for trying something and giving something a go. I'm just very curious to see if it really changes up anything in there and how they desire it, at least. Does it bring about the desired changes that they want or not? We shall find out. But let's talk about Portimao finally to close out. Now, last time I butchered how to pronounce the whole Italian Imola Grand Prix. So I'm not going to do it again because I disgraced myself plenty of times on this. So, but we have. I mean, it's a fair to say a fan favorite track from last year. A really exciting track. Let me bring that up for people. So, and again, if you're on podcasts, you can Google Portimao F1 and you'll find the track. So there it is in all its glory. Will, how much did you enjoy, just curious, going off last year, how much did you enjoy the Portimao track, and are you excited to see it again this weekend?
Yeah, I enjoyed the race last year. It was a sort of almost like a rehearsal for Turkey in just how it was really cold and just the tyres weren't working, and the cars that got their tyres working early really made up positions. You obviously saw Kimi Raikkonen storming from 16th to 6th on the first lap, and then Carlos Sainz getting up into first. Obviously, that didn't last. But I think they will have done something with the DRS. I think they've moved it back a bit just so it isn't as easy to overtake as it was last year. But I just think the elevation changes make it a really unique circuit. And you just seeing that it's sort of just a better Catalonia, really.
Yeah, we should add, and as people can see who are watching the video, but I'll say it for the podcast listeners, 66 laps is what we're expecting. Lewis Hamilton holds the lap record with a 1:18.750. So one of the faster circuits. Joe, I know you were a huge fan of the race coming to Portimao last year, or to the Autodromo Internacional do Algarve. There we go. What are your thoughts on it? I mean, I'm guessing you're pretty excited that Formula One's coming back to the circuit.
I've already wasted an awful lot of time obsessing over just how much I love this track, so I'm not going to waste any more. I'm really, really excited that it's back. I hope it becomes a permanent fixture because it's one of the very few tracks that actually suits this generation of Formula One cars, which I've criticised an awful lot for being so big, so aerodynamically reliant. Last year, we got one hell of a race here, and it wasn't just because of the changeable conditions. When this place dried up, it still provided one hell of a spectacle. It's also just an amazingly beautiful part of the world to go to. The Algarve is just stunning, and those elevation changes that Will's talked about really accentuate it. I think it's one of the best racetracks in Europe. It's great MotoGP was there last weekend, and that was an amazing race as well. It's just a brilliantly designed place, and it should be on the calendar every year. I keep saying this. Liberty, make it happen.
Well, for now, I guess it's a bit like an audition period for the track, for organizers and for the race itself. So yeah, having looked at the track, let's talk about who we think has a good chance of doing well on this track. Will, is there, don't give us like podium predictions, we'll ask that in a bit, but just, knowing the track and knowing how obviously we went there last year, how do you feel, which teams do you feel like will have a good weekend in Portugal?
I think, again, it's hard to say. There's quite a few fast corners, so I think obviously Red Bull seem to have the best car this year, so obviously they're going to be up there. Mercedes will be up there. And I think it will be sort of the same, but I do think AlphaTauri will sort out their issues and be up nearer Ferrari and McLaren. But I just think it will be a good race. I think what we're going to see at least 1, 2, or 3 just continual battles around at least 5 or 6 corners, as we saw last year with Ocon and Perez. And I do think that if you're looking for a race to watch, then this will probably be one of the best ones to watch this season.
Yeah, just going off, and I have the luxury of having sort of these stats in front of me, but looking at how qualifying went last year, it was a Mercedes front row in 2020, with Max Verstappen 0.2 of a second behind Valtteri Bottas, who was second, and Charles Leclerc was 4th, and Sergio Perez was 5th. So in theory, all the sort of the front running cars have good track records coming into this, and yeah, it should promise some really good entertainment. Interestingly, the race classification, only the top from 5th onwards, everyone was lapped. So that is quite a that's quite a unique sort of result that you rarely see in this sport. But yeah, Joe, what do you reckon? Who do you feel like has a good chance of having some good performances in Portugal?
Far from an engineering expert, but from what we've seen so far, I think this track is... It's not that it suits the Mercedes, I just think the downfalls of that Mercedes car will be less apparent here. Combine that with Hamilton just being a really, really good driver, for want of better phrasing. I think this is going to be a Lewis Hamilton win, just ahead of Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. Actually, I'm predicting them to have a good weekend, but I'm with Will as well. This track suits AlphaTauri because that Honda power unit is fiery this year.
Yeah, interestingly, Pierre Gasly came 5th last year, so obviously strong pedigree. And interesting, Lando Norris came 13th. So
yeah,
he'll obviously want
to. Out.
Yeah, he'll obviously want to right that wrong. So should be interesting to see how those drivers go at it again. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, just sort of excited to see how it goes. Really, obviously, third race. Yeah, it's the third race. It feels like we've talked about Formula One throughout the whole year, to be honest. And the fact that we've only had 2 races is quite remarkable. But I'll just quickly add in the weather report. Saturday, qualifying wise, 19 degrees, partly cloudy, not much chance of rain from what I can tell. And same with Saturday, slightly warmer, 21 degrees. Again, mostly sunny, very little chance of rain. So dry conditions, nothing like what we saw in Imola. So pretty straightforward on that front. And with that said, I guess we'll wrap it up with some top 3 predictions. So as we did last time, I'll ask Joe and Will for podium predictions, and also maybe a driver outside of the Mercedes Red Bull sort of group, a driver who will surprise people, who may have a great race outside, maybe a high finish in the top 10 or something like that. So Joe, I'll come to you. Top 3 and I don't know, a wild card surprise driver.
Hamilton to start on pole and win the race, Verstappen second, Norris third, and contrary to what I went on about earlier, I think Yuki Tsunoda is going to have a very good weekend.
It does suit his approach, I would say. This track does sort of suit his aggressive approach, so that's something to look out for sure. Will, same question. Podium, top 3, and maybe a driver outside who may have a good race, surprisingly, maybe.
I'll go for something a bit different. I do think Hamilton will win. I might go Perez, Verstappen. I think Verstappen might have a few issues engineering wise, and I think that the other driver outside the top 10 who might have a good race, or maybe not outside the top 10, but I think it'll be George Russell. I think he'll want to ride the Russell at Imola, and this may be the race he scores his first points for Williams.
Well, let's hope we've not reverse jinxed him or reverse cursed him. But yes, he obviously, as we've alluded to, he is a very popular fan base. I'm sure a lot of people would be very happy if he ended up in the top 10. But yeah, that will probably do it for us, to be honest. So thank you so much for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for listening. If you're listening to the podcast, we will be back probably next week, because the gap between Portugal and Spain is just 1 week. So it will be a very quick turnaround for us. Obviously, Saturday we'll have the football quorum stream. Most likely we'll talk about the Super League. Obviously, we'll wait. I mean, obviously, Champions League semi-finals going on at the moment, but it does feel like the Super League cloud is sort of above all sort of football news. So we'll get to dive into that. And yeah, here's hoping we get a great weekend Formula One wise in Portugal. But I want to thank Will and Joe for coming on. It's been great to hear you guys. You can follow them, the social media sort of tickers going around, so you can follow them on Instagram for those accounts. And we will see you. We will see you next when we see you for Formula One. At least we'll see you next week. So thank you very much for watching and listening, and have a good rest of your week.